Okay, Richard. Yeah.
Sure, if you sit, then I'll sit.
Apologies, I would prefer to stand, but you guys sit, I'll sit.
Good evening, and welcome to the forum. I'm Dick Neustadt. I'm a professor emeritus at the Kennedy School. I was once director of the Institute of Politics, and I throw that in only because it is the Institute that operates these forums for, in the first instance, students of the school, and second, very importantly, Harvard undergraduates, because the Institute itself is primarily devoted to the interests of Harvard undergraduates. And third, to students in the wider Harvard community. And fourth, to people in the general Cambridge community. And if you recognize yourselves in any of those categories, we say welcome. If you do not recognize yourself in any of those categories, you're still welcome. So, our subject tonight is leadership. We haven't further qualified that. We will leave it to our panel to do so. Let me briefly introduce the panel, and then, having introduced all three of them so you have a sense of who they are, I'll proceed. 1, 2, 3. We may have some discussion within the panel. Afterwards, we will certainly leave time for questions, and I'll say this later again, but just so you can get your minds around it, there are 2 mics tonight, one here and one here, and people can line up for questions, and they'll be taken in order, and anyone up there who wants to come down is more than welcome to do so for a question. But they haven't put mics up there because with the lighting, it's almost impossible for us to see people to recognize there. So we'll have to subject those of you who are there to the inconvenience of coming there. Now, you may want to know why an emeritus professor is moderating a panel on leadership. It is an odd question. I have the privilege of entering classes, but I may not do so alone. Nor am I allowed to sign grade sheets. I'm welcome at faculty meetings, but I am not allowed to vote. A position more powerless and less leader-like than this is hard to imagine. That is not the reason I was asked to chair or moderate this panel. The reason is that I have particular warm relations with each member of the panel, and it was thought that I was a fit person to introduce all 3. The 2 of them I've managed to mentor to some extent, and I'm an honest and honorable shill for both their recent books. I appear on the back cover of one, and I've actually written a foreword to the other. I'll tell you about both of them before you get out of it. As for the 3rd member of this panel, I am a permanent aide de camp. And it seems fitting, therefore, that I should do the mechanical work. So I'm about to do it. The panelists, in order. I'm sorry, are Richard Haas. Richard was in the Department of State, was then a lecturer at the Kennedy School, was then a director in the National Security Council staff and a special assistant to the president in Mr. Bush's time on the Middle East and South Asia, an area that got considerable attention in Mr. Bush's time, as you may remember, if it isn't too far back. He has written an absolutely delightful book called The Power to Persuade, which deals with the most immediate problem that younger people here will face when they leave the school or the college and go into their first bureaucratic job. Now, not every one of them will go into a bureaucratic job, but a great many will. And Richard's book tells you how to think about what you're doing and how to protect yourself while doing it from the day you sit down at your desk for the first time. Oh, I can commend it, therefore, to all those who are about to take that plunge within a year or so, and, of course, to all the older people who, having taken it, have had reason to regret some of the episodes of their bureaucratic lives. Next is Ronnie Heifetz, Ronald Heifetz. Dr. Heifetz is an associate professor at the Kennedy School. He's also a musician and an MD. We asked him 10 years ago to think about the vexed subject of what leadership might consist of, that our students who are actually going into the real world could make some use out of. And he spent 10 years running interesting, controversial courses which have taught his students much and him a lot. The upshot, both in terms of what he's taught his students and what they've taught him, is this book, Leadership Without Easy Answers, which deals both at the level of leaders in positions of high authority and at the level of people trying to exercise leadership from the side, from behind, or from below. And finally, we have someone who has been in all the positions discussed by these two books, Shirley Williams, who's a professor of electoral politics at the Kennedy School, but who in private life, when she isn't doing that, is a member of the upper house in Britain and a senior private person in the Liberal Democratic Party. And she was once, in the not too distant past, the founder or the co-founder of one of the two parties that merged into the Liberal Democrats in Britain, the Social Democratic Party, which was created by a group of people who left the Labour Party, an act of leadership from something other than the top, one might say from the side. And before that, she was a member of the last British Labour cabinet. She was Secretary of State for Education and Science. Before that, she was a Minister of State in half a dozen British government departments. Well, during all that time and preceding it a bit, she was a member of Parliament in the House of Commons, not the House of Lords where she now is. And in her earlier life, just as in her present life, she had quite a lot of the experience that Richard Haas refers to, being young and starting in a bureaucratic environment. So you have two students who can bring you the most recent thinking in the field. I don't have to worry about saying that. Neither of these books has been out very long. And Shirley actually is a competitor with them in Britain, though not here. She has just finished presiding over a BBC program on leadership, which involved generals, business leaders, even leaders in the arts, as I recall. And for those of you who are interested, you will presently be able to find it over here. There's the tape, BBC. So I've now shilled for all three of them. Now we can proceed. Without further ado, having done my duty, I offer you Richard Haas.
Thank you, Dick, I think. It's great to be back at Harvard. It's an honor to be next to these three people. This is a great title. I like it, Leadership. I was thinking the people who run this forum, their challenge, and if they had called it Followership, how many of you would have been here tonight? Where I get all my humor from is Reader's Digest. And there was one of those things like, I don't know, Humor in America, or one of those corny things they do. There was one about someone who applied to college and she'd gotten in, and I guess on the form that she had to fill out, they said, do you consider yourself a leader or a follower? And she thought very hard about it and checked follower. And she got her congratulations letter from whatever state university it was saying, congratulations, you've been accepted, but we thought you should know that out of a class of 300, you were the only follower. Something tells me at Harvard the numbers would be about the same if they added that on the application. What I wanted to do is just take a few minutes. We've been carefully constrained here, and maybe make about 5 points about leadership, and in part with the goal of leaving as much time as here as possible for you all. I'll speak in fairly large generalities because my hunch was that in the questions you'd all zero in on us and pin us down. First, real leadership is not measured by the ability to have followers. If the opposite were true, if leadership were simply measured by the ability to have followers, generals and admirals would be great leaders, when in fact, not all are. And I'd actually go so far as to say that followership is the minimum requirement for someone to be a leader. The problem is that if you simply measure leadership by followership, you may get nothing more than that, which is the simple act of following, that if you command, they salute. And what you really want, if you're a leader, is something more. You want initiative, you want excellence and all that. You want more than the minimal quantifiable performance. And again, you are unlikely to get that if all you want is or are followers. Secondly, and that relates to my next point, is that if you look in the literature of leadership, and I haven't had a chance yet to read Ronnie's book, and I don't know how he defines it, but in the books that do exist on leadership, there are certain similarities in definitions. And there's a certain general thread, and I expect actually he doesn't share it, having spent many hours in this school arguing with him. My hunch is he's actually understood this better than most of his predecessors, is the idea that the definition that you often see, which is that leadership is somehow, that leadership is the ability to persuade others to make your goals theirs. And it's said in many different ways, but the whole idea is the idea that if you can get other people to adopt your goals, your objectives, you've been a successful leader. And that is probably, it's almost intuitive. Again, though, it doesn't ring true to me. Because by that definition, people who are really good orators would be great leaders, and demagogues would probably be the best leaders of all, because they are historically the people who are best at getting people to adopt their vision, their set of objectives. And it's obviously too easily destructive. And at the end of the day, these people have not really built a lot. They've not left a lot behind them, a lot of a legacy, and implicit in leadership has to be something of value and of quality and something that remains, because otherwise you really haven't gone anywhere. Because leadership does imply movement. It is not simply a noun, it's not simply a quality, but it's ultimately a moving process towards somewhere. Which then brings me to more what leadership is, and I would simply say that it is the ability to persuade people to adopt things and all that, but it's also the ability still to be persuaded. And that leadership, funnily enough, involves as much listening as directing. And I think it's probably counterintuitive, because again, we think of people as leaders as people who point, but in fact, the best leaders are people who not only point, but people who listen. They have to be willing to adapt and adopt as much as anything. What this requires, I would say, is an ability to have a philosophy. And the distinction I used to use when I taught here was the difference between a philosophy and an ideology. And philosophy, I thought, was basically helpful, and ideology wasn't, because philosophy, while it provided direction, still left room for taking in things, whereas ideology, while it provided direction, really left no room. It was too complete, and it really didn't have anymore the ability to absorb. So I think leaders need philosophy in order to provide direction and movement, but it can't be so complete and so firm and so hard that it can't absorb, which is what I think an ideology tends to be. The good news here, and if it's one point that I would probably leave you with, is the idea that this process of listening and pointing at the same time, it's basically interacting, that it improves the goals where you want to take people. In a funny sort of way, the best leaders are people who they don't actually know necessarily the specific goals they want to get to. They may have a general direction, but they can listen enough and they can adjust enough so it actually improves the quality of the places they want to get to. And, most important of all, it increases the chance they'll get there. And this whole process of leading and listening, which is an interactive one, means that when you go out with general ideas and general objectives and say, I basically want to move over there, but then you listen enough so you might adjust it 10 degrees this side or the other, and in the process you actually increase your odds of getting there. Because the reason is, in this process of interacting, not only have you learned something, not only perhaps have you refined your thinking and taken on board some ideas you hadn't begun with, but because you've interacted with people and you've given them their day in court, and you've given them a chance to say things and to be heard, their resistance to whatever you are likely to be proposing tends to be less. Most people, me included, and I think probably most of you, if you feel you've had a chance to voice your views and you've had a chance to sit down and hear other people's views and not simply their end result, but the reasoning that led them there, your resistance to what they want tends to be less. And secondly, when you go about implementing it, because you understand it, you might actually do a better job of not screwing it up unintentionally. So intentional resistance tends to be less, and unintentional resistance tends to be less if people are given a chance to participate in the leadership process. So the third point is really that leadership ends up being a solitary endeavor, but really it ends up being a very communal endeavor, and the best leaders are people who are highly interactive. The only caveat I would add to that, or as Al Haig, my former boss, would say, let me caveat that for you, would be don't overdo it. Simply because you hear people out and you listen doesn't mean you have to take all of it on board. You know, sometimes a leader does have to say no. It's useful if you then explain why you've done it and all that, and you may convince people, you may not. And the one rule of thumb I give to people who want to act as leaders is that particularly people who are around you, their views of feasibility should be given great weight, because often they might be more of an expert in some particular technical area, but their views of desirability as to general direction probably ought not to count as much as yours, because after all, you're moving out on your own philosophy and all that. So I think there is something to be said for listening, but it does not necessarily mean accepting. Let me just make two more points, and then I'll hand things over to Ronnie. In most of the literature on leadership, besides this definitional thing I talked about convincing other people to adopt your goals, will be the idea that there's a fundamental divide between leading and managing. And I brought my book along not to quote from myself at length, but just let me give you one or two quotes that other people use. Management is the bottom line focus. How can I best accomplish certain things? Leadership deals with the top line. What are the things I want to accomplish? Or secondly, management is efficiency in climbing the ladder of success. Leadership determines whether the ladder is leaning against the right wall. Or thirdly, and probably most succinctly, managers are people who do things right, and leaders are people who do the right things. And you will find this dichotomy throughout the literature. If I may borrow from the gentleman who just won the Democratic primary for mayor in the city of Washington, if I may adopt part of his message to the voters of Ward 3, less than 3% of whom supported him in the recent primary, you've got to get over that hang-up. Well, you have got to get over the hang-up that there is somehow a choice or a dichotomy between leaders and managers. And what I would simply say, a leader who is not a manager, it will end up being a feckless and futile enterprise. Because if you simply have ideas and you haven't put together the wherewithal to make those ideas happen, you haven't really done an awful lot of work. But similarly, if you only think about process and you have no direction, you may burn up an awful lot of calories at the end of the day, but you are unlikely to have really moved very far. You will, in a sense, been moving things and working hard, but to what aim, to what direction? And things may simply cancel out or not be added up. So again, any leader has to be as much of a manager as he is a leader, and vice versa. Any manager has to be a leader as well. The two go hand in hand. They're sides of the same coin. And if you ever hear a professor or anybody else trying to draw a distinction, I would have at them. Lastly, one other hang-up to get over in the Marion Barry School of Public Policy, if you will, is to get over the idea that leadership is something that bosses do. And if you think about it, it took me a long time to get over it, but we tend to think of leadership as something that bosses do. That leadership is something which travels from north to south, from the top down. And it's basically generals in the military, or deans at the Kennedy School, or governors at states, or what have you. And we think of it as very much a top-down, and that's true. That is one thing, that's one form of leadership. And some of those people who are in positions of power may actually be leaders. But people can lead from anywhere. And it's almost the good news message that you can be the bottom person in an organization, and if you can write and speak with some authority, and you can marshal your ideas and write a decent memo or make a decent oral presentation, and you can take an idea and show how it can actually be implemented, you can lead everyone to your north who's above you very well, including your boss. You can basically take your boss and lead him or her by making them, in a sense, adopt your agenda. Similarly, you can lead to the east with your colleagues. Again, if you have ideas, if you work with them, if you network with them, if you take your ideas to them, you absorb what you can of theirs, you will likely be an effective leader of your colleagues, even though they don't work for you. They simply work with you. And similarly, you will be a leader to your west with the organizations and institutions that may have nothing to do with you directly. It might be the media, or if you're in, say, a state government or a local government, it might be, if you work in the executive branch, it might be in a legislative branch. If you work in government, it might be in an interest group. If you work in an interest group, it might be the person in government. If you take your ideas, you build coalitions, you show that they have political support, that you show that they are feasible, that these ideas are not only worth doing, but they can be done, you will have led. And that is really my last message, that yes, you can lead when you're the boss, but there's no need and there's no reason to wait until then before you start leading. Indeed, if you wait until you're the boss before you start leading, my hunch is you ain't never going to become the boss. So start leading early, or as they say in voting in Chicago, lead early and often, and my hunch is you will find yourselves moving up. Thank you.
Now, Ronnie Heifetz, you want to use this? If you'd rather sit, you may. Okay.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with all of you. It's particularly a pleasure to have Richard Neustadt, to whom I owe much of my work these last nearly dozen years, moderating this program. Because, well, there are lots of reasons why I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Richard Neustadt. First of all, I'm not sure the Kennedy School would be here if it weren't for Richard Neustadt. And if the Kennedy School weren't here, it certainly wouldn't be here in its current form at all. There would have been no opportunity for me to have, what could a psychiatrist and a musician know about leadership? All I could possibly bring to this subject were a set of metaphors and images and maybe a little theory. But really the people who've taught me about leadership, and Dick alludes to this, have been my students. It's been through the process of hearing hundreds of stories of success and failure by your predecessors, people eager to try to elucidate what went wrong and what went right, to capture the right lessons. It's been through that task of trying to help them capture those lessons that I've had the opportunity to develop a set of concepts, practical wisdom in a sense. At best, an orienting philosophy of leadership that has taken into account these stories. So what I'd like to share with you are simply a couple of the ideas that have grown out of this storytelling and interpretation of storytelling business that I've been in for a long time. The central challenge, the central question that I've been working on through my students and with my students has been, how can someone mobilize other people to tackle tough problems, problems that require changes in people's lives, and not get killed off in the process? Because lots of my students have, most of them, have plenty of scars to show for the times when they've tried to exercise leadership and gotten hurt in the process, pushed aside, maimed in various ways. It would be easy to exercise leadership if leadership were about giving people good news. What makes it dangerous, what makes it tough, is that you're trying to mobilize people who have conflicting values, people who, in a sense, are part of the problem. And therefore, the solution requires changes in their minds, changes in their behaviors. So, the first distinction that I draw in my book is a fairly simple distinction. It's between technical problems, routine problems, problems that already lie within our repertoire, problems for which we have the expertise. We know which authority to call on the subject. We have the procedures and the norms worked out for mobilizing the proper response. And we have lots of problems like that. We also have lots of problems. They tend to be more persistent, intractable problems, at times they seem, because the problems don't fall neatly into any organizational division. No procedure will suffice. No expert can be called to set the bone. We have a whole host of problems of that nature. Indeed, most of the problems that we address at the Kennedy School are problems of that nature, what I would call adaptive challenges. I'll give you an example. In 1988, the number one issue, the ripe issue in our country, was drug abuse. That was the issue most people felt most urgent about, according to polling. That put enormous pressure on the new president, President Bush, Richard's former boss, to do something. Because, of course, to whom do we look for answers when we're experiencing a tough problem? We look to people in authority. We hope that somebody in authority can solve this problem for us. Indeed, we say, that's what we hired you for. Do something about this problem. Indeed, people actually look to authorities yearning that these adaptive problems can be treated as if they were technical, as if somebody with the proper authoritative command and the proper leverage and the right expertise could summon forth the wisdom and the power to get it done. But drug abuse is a typical example of a problem that can't be done that way, because the problem of drug abuse exists in families all across this country. It exists in neighborhoods that no longer function as a safety net to take care of kids being raised by a single parent, overwhelmed by carrying one or two jobs already, uncertain about how to set limits on a teenager. It exists in our schools with teachers that want to teach what they know how to teach, reading, writing, arithmetic. They don't want to be social workers. It exists in our churches where clergy no longer speak relevantly to people, where people go to the mall on Sunday. It exists in our businesses where people don't want to take the risk of hiring those folks in our society who see no reason to join in, no hope in joining the economic mainstream. It exists in tax-paying behaviors where people don't want to invest in the kind of measures it would take to address some of the sources of drug abuse and related crime. But think how difficult it would be for the chief authority of the country, the president, who's looked to solve this problem, to get up in front of the nation and say, I know you look to me to solve this problem. I know you wished that we could solve this problem through some simple set of programs. But the problem exists in your lives, in your neighborhoods, in your habits of parenting, in your business habits. Many of you are going to have to face adjustments. You're going to have to learn if we're going to address this problem. How tough it would be for him to give that kind of speech. Indeed, people all around our country have such a burning desire for a quick fix, an easy answer, that they basically say to people in authority, you either get up and give us a fake remedy, but do it with conviction, or we're not going to elect you again. Now, of course, they don't say it that way. They don't say give us a fake remedy. They say we want a real remedy. But what that forces a person to do is provide any kind of remedy in the hope that people won't discover what's happened until it's no longer your watch. Or maybe they really believe that they're doing something positive, because after a while, when everybody's staring at you for an answer, you maybe begin to believe you have an answer. So the kind of leadership I've been trying to develop is a conception that can address what can an individual do, what strategy and tactics can a person use to tell people what they need to hear and not what they want to hear. And in that conception, I'd suggest to you 3 out of a host of ideas in the book about staying alive. The first is that if you're going to exercise leadership, either from a position of authority, or as Richard has wonderfully described in his book, from positions of junior authority or from without authority, people lateral to you over whom you have no authority, you've got to distinguish technical from adaptive problems. Either mistake of treating one like the other has its problems. For example, as Richard alluded to, if you treat a technical problem as if it were adaptive, you're going to think that you're supposed to carry on this widely inclusive process of taking into account everybody's point of view. And then what you have is kind of this paralysis that takes place, as if everything has to be subjected to an egalitarian deliberation. When what you really need is to say, my God, the kid is bleeding, call somebody who knows how to stop the bleeding, get him in here to take care of the kid. Let's not discuss this right now. And there are lots of problems that are like that. Indeed, many places in our society where people are ideologically committed to egalitarianism, we see the ineffective uses of authority because nobody's willing to authorize anybody else to take charge. But the opposite failure is just as common, treating adaptive problems as if they were technical, trying to provide expert answers instead of carrying on slower, but possibly, probably, more targeted interventions that draw in those people who actually have the problem. The parents, the teachers, the neighbors, the business people, the taxpayers, and so forth. Having distinguished in a technical from an adaptive problem, it would seem to me the next task is to identify which of these adaptive challenges is ripe to tackle. Because any community, even any business, might face a whole slew of adaptive challenges. And one has to figure out the pace at which one is going to challenge people to learn new ways. People can't learn everything at once. We already have a society overwhelmed by all they read in the newspaper. The basic idea comes down to this. Leadership in the context of adaptive challenges requires engaging a learning strategy, a strategy that engages the relevant people in a process of reevaluating their habits, their values, or whatever it's going to take to tackle the problem. And a learning strategy then has to pay profound respect to the rate at which, the resilience with which people can absorb challenging messages. Well, I'll look forward this year to hearing many of your stories and taking the theory to the next step of clarification. Thanks.
Ronnie is famous for tossing out a formulation and leaving it there with something with which, of course, the next speaker has to deal. But she may refuse to deal with it. I offer you Professor Williams.
Well, let me say right away that I think that both Ronnie and Richard's book are a substantial contribution to the study of leadership, and also that I'm always troubled by a great deal of emphasis on leadership. I think we're looking at times when there are two conflicting trends going on. One is the trend that is profoundly suspicious of leadership, that in a way almost yearns for leaders to be shown to be no better and no more intelligent and no more effective than the rest of us. You don't need to do more than read the newspapers for a week to see the process of endlessly demoting leaders and reducing them to the level of ourselves or somewhat less than ourselves. But on the other hand, there is a different trend, one I find quite frightening, which is the trend that yearns for leadership, that, as the existentialists put it, is frightened of freedom, and that because at the present time we are passing through a period of profound insecurity, both personal and societal, seeks to find in leaders the answers to problems that we aren't able to answer for ourselves. Ronnie Heifetz, in his book, faces this directly and comes up with what one might describe as the answer of inclusive leadership. A leadership that brings into the answers the people who are part of the problem, and that confronts them with the need to take part in finding the solutions themselves. But of course, that may not be what people want. And I find, traveling in Europe and the United States, an increasing desire to find a leader who will carry the burden of choice for us, who will make decisions for us, who will allow us to go on living our lives without being troubled by the issues that confront us, because at some instinctual level we recognize that those problems are almost greater than we dare to confront. What do I mean by saying that they're almost greater than we dare to confront? We confront for the first time a Western world in which it's probable that most of us will not be richer but poorer in 2 generations. We confront a Western world where no nation any longer can command outcomes. And that's particularly difficult for countries that have relished power and relished the capacity to shape the world to actually come to terms with. We live, as Ronnie has said, in worlds where some of the things that we expected to happen, namely that our societies would grow closer and more cohesive, seem to be moving in the opposite direction as we see societies fragmented and individuals increasingly unwilling to accept responsibility for one another. So we look to leaders, not to lead us, but rather to solve the problems of our conscience and to take responsibility for what we do not ourselves wish to do. So the Ronnie Heifetz answer is a tough answer. It's one many people may not wish to listen to. I suspect it's even tougher than Ronnie himself recognizes. I've said that because these conflicting views of leaders, the difference between the wish to create an atmosphere in which leaders are brought down to our size, where deference has disappeared as a political concept, side by side with the desire to escape responsibility, is an extremely difficult combination of factors to have to deal with. And what we see increasingly is that leaders follow, that leaders pursue the followers, that they measure and estimate what the followers want and then put themselves, as Talleyrand said, in front of the followers. In other words, the leader smells the wind, looks at where the gathering swine are galloping, and makes sure that he's in front of them just before they run over the edge of the abyss. That seems to me not a bad metaphor for much leadership today. Ronnie says to us, and he's right, that one of the features of modern leadership, leadership in a democratic society, and I don't use the term only politically, in the widest sense a society that wants to be part of decision-making, is a leadership that needs to be one that seeks not just to form a consensus, we're all used to that. Modern management styles, as we know from the Japanese and others, is all about trying to find the basis of consensus. But something even more challenging than that, which is the concept that everybody is brought into trying to create the consensus. It isn't the leader who searches for the consensus, but the leader who mobilizes everybody else to search for the consensus. There are two problems about this. One is, and we may as well face it, that there are many members of our societies who actually reject the concept of consensus from the very word go. Because if you believe in the concept of some kind of absolute truth, not a truth you have to fight for, not a truth, to use Richard's description, you have to persuade other people to accept, but a truth that is absolute if you can only see it and discover it, if you're enlightened enough to perceive it. That kind of truth is part of a fundamentalist approach, which means that a consensus is in many ways antipathetic to the very things that you stand for. If I may quote one remarkable leader, but certainly not a consensual one, Mrs. Margaret Thatcher, she once said, "The act of consensus is the negation of leadership." Now, she's a sufficiently serious leader for one not to be able to laugh that off. Because one of the things that people seek in their leaders is a degree of confidence in what they believe, a degree of conviction, which makes them lift from us the burden of having to think through where we stand and where we're going. That kind of missionary leader, the leader who has no doubts about him or herself, is a very attractive leader in many ways because they do not force upon us the necessity of sharing responsibility for leadership. So one of the major styles of leadership, the command style, one of the oldest and most traditional styles of leadership, has undoubtedly a major attraction for many of us. And we can't pretend it isn't there as an alternative style of leadership. There's the style of leadership, and those members of my class who are here will forgive me for repeating myself for just a moment, which rejects the whole idea of politics, of the discussions and debate of politics in the broadest sense, because it regards that discussion and that debate as essentially reducing what are obvious and clear directions and purposes to the level of bargaining and compromise. Your now totally regenerated president, Jimmy Carter, is a very good example of this. A man who rejected politics because he saw politics as reducing his mission of national interest to the usual bargains and deals and all the rest of it that he himself eschewed. A very interesting case of somebody who perceived himself as part of a national mission. Jimmy Carter to me is interesting for another reason, and here I pay him credit. he did perceive that being a political leader, at least, is to recognize that the human beings who make up a society are something more than elements in a technical analysis, or for that matter, an economy. It's one of the dangers we run in the Kennedy School to see too many technical fixes as the definition of leadership. But when one looks at a Nelson Mandela, one perceives that there are elements of leadership that are to do, and this comes back again to what Ronnie has to say, with mobilizing not just the capacity to adapt, but the extraordinary resources of the human being. To my mind, one of the most inspiring things about the replacement of apartheid in South Africa with the government of national unity was the extraordinary willingness of Mandela and a very different person, de Klerk, a much more political figure, to perceive that they had to mobilize the human resources of South Africa, including the illiterate and uneducated resources, in order to be able to make the leap from a society that was authoritarian and hierarchical to one where people began to accept responsibility for the outcomes. And to my mind, the extraordinary thing about this was that they appealed to people's spiritual resources, since there were neither educational nor economic resources to be appealed to. It brings me finally to what I want to say in conclusion about the nature of leadership. All leaders face both internal and external constraints. The external constraints of their audience, their voters, their shareholders, whoever it may be, who they have to take into account in terms of how they direct their leadership. And there's also internal constraints in the sense of the constraints of being one of a number of colleagues, in terms of trying to deal with your followers, in terms of trying to deal with the expectations of the society of which you're part. The mark of a great leader is, I think, to be able to redefine his or her mission in such a way as essentially to burst through these internal and external constraints, to do so by redefining the goal to which they are reaching. And again, to conclude with the example of South Africa, the fascinating thing about South Africa, and we'll have to see whether Jerry Adams on Friday night can rise to the same challenge, was the capacity to turn the extraordinary potential and power of a set of negative political reactions, terrorism, military might, force, coercion, fear, almost overnight, into a similar power to express positive outcomes. It's the hardest thing in politics. It's the most exciting thing in politics. It's the proper measure of a leader today. And I believe that the great achievement of Mandela and de Klerk was to actually, at least to this day, to bring that about, to burst out from the negative into a statement of positive mobilization of resources. So in commending my two fellow panelists and what they have to say about leadership, let me commend what they have to say about leadership, while at the same time saying as strongly as I can, that leaders are not much better than their followers, that the concept of leadership and followership is in many ways a strange one in a democracy, and that I believe Ronnie is right in saying that how far one can mobilize the human resources of a society is actually, in the end, the measure of what it is to be an outstanding democratic leader.
Before I turn to the audience here, and I want people who want to have questions should line up. I want to give the members of the panel a chance to do what they have not clearly done up to now. And ask a sharp question of at least one other panelist if something's on their minds that they've suppressed up to this point. Because I found here a sort of a thematic unity, which is not the reputation that my two younger colleagues had when they were together here. Either life has altered them both, or there's something under the table. If there is, let's get it on the surface.
I think what's probably altered both Ronnie and I is that both of us have two young children. And we've learned the difference between theory and practice when it comes to leadership.
I think that's true. I think I've learned the importance of authority. And Richard's learned the importance of inclusion.
I have a question for Richard.
Yeah.
I want to ask him how far his perceptions of the position of a leader in a relatively middle rank position in terms of the hierarchy changed as a result of experience. I mean, in your book you tell us quite a lot about the way in which you deal with that, but how much can you point to the changes that actually occurred between what you perceived before you went into office and the conclusions you reach afterwards?
At the risk of sounding contradictory, two things.
Sure.
One is a sense of possibility, the other is the reality of constraint. Possibility is because you're always working for people in a bureaucracy who have greater responsibility than you have. They have, in a sense, greater horizontal reach. So they have to be somewhat dependent on you because you almost invariably have a narrower purview than they do. And they have really no choice but to depend on you, because whether they like to delegate or not, there are times they're stuck with you. And if you are creative about it, they will actually look for times to be stuck with you. And people who are good merchandisers of ideas can have tremendous impact. And I never cease to be amazed how titles of positions and rank mean less and less as administrations say go on. And where people fight for that in the opening months, by the time a year or two goes by, nobody cares what your title is. And they'll bring you into the room if you've got something to contribute, and they will find ways of keeping you out of the room if you don't. And that's a sense of opportunity. That's the good news. The other thing is, on the other side, is how hard it is. I never cease to be amazed by how hard government is. And the centrifugal forces are powerful. And you know, the image I always used to use, and Bob Blackwell, who teaches here, and I used to laugh about it at times, was fighting the Vietnam War. And just when you thought you had that strategic hamlet safe, and you kind of went to bed at night, you'd wake up in the morning and you found that the guys in the black pajamas had taken it again. And that was sort of what I felt the bureaucracy was like. It was that just when I thought I had an issue solved and I thought I had a decision made, I'd come back to work at some, we used to call dark 30 the next morning, and I'd show up, and I found that something invariably happened during the night, and the centrifugal forces had gotten me again. George Shultz once said, things are never over in this town. And he was speaking about Washington, but I think it could have been anywheresville, USA. There are so many constituencies with separate power. And what I think makes, funnily enough, managing effectively or leading effectively in a democracy in the public sector so hard, and even harder than business, if our friends across the river will forgive me, is because you're dealing with multiple constituencies that are independently based. And there's so many of them, and they have so many resources, and our political system seems bent on enhancing their capacities. So our centralizing institutions and forces are getting weaker as the years go on. Our decentralizing, our centrifugal institutions and forces are getting stronger. And I never cease to be amazed by how hard it is to get anything done and to make it stick. And just when you think you've gotten the decision, you've gotten the policy, you find that in the implementation phase, it all gets revisited again and again and again. So leadership, coming back to the theme of tonight, I really came away with the sense in government about how hard it was because it was never over. It really was a process that got worked out over time. What made the Gulf War for someone like me a fun experience, if I may use that word, but really uncharacteristic, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, which this school teaches as if it were a model of reality, when in fact it is a model of unreality, is the very fact that it was a crisis that happened over a short amount of time immediately removes it in some way from the day-to-day politics. And it allows people to exercise unusual authority and unusual isolation. But those are the exceptions. The average issue on the average day is fought out by a gazillion people who have umpty-ump ways to get at it, and it's never over. And that is my, on most issues, it's more a sense of exhaustion than it is a satisfaction. I hope you all have very nice careers in the public sector.
This would be true to a large degree of any democratic system, but it probably is particularly true of ours. It was planned that way. The Constitution sets it up that way. We've got another colleague with relevant Washington experience, Philip Zelikow, who's been standing the longest, I think. So he has the right to ask the first question from the floor that I'll turn to this microphone next.
This is a question for all three members of the panel. When Richard gave his presentation, I immediately started making a list of all the leaders in history who did not fit his criteria. There's people who did not listen well, were not good managers, and so on. So my quick list included William Jennings Bryan, who so vitally influenced people like John Altgeld and Darrow and so on. John Calvin, Lenin, not considered a good listener. But some might say, showed some characteristics, showed potential as a leader. William Lloyd Garrison, or the British equivalent Wilberforce. Winston Churchill, not well known either as a good listener or a good manager. Ayatollah Khomeini. Jesus Christ, according to the biblical interpretation. Someone you might say felt he had a complete ideology. Mahatma Gandhi. So then I thought, now that's fine and all well and good. See, the problem is that after you do this list, the problem I have is that I actually believe Richard is right. Actually, that the book is valuable, the advice is valuable. This is how can those two beliefs simultaneously be true? That the book is right, yet there are so many examples that do not fit the book, or at least a very, very tiny synthesis of the book that you got today. And maybe one answer to that conundrum is that leadership is a cultural construct of our particular values here in 1994 in America, which may be different from Iran in 1994 or other places. But one way I wanted to try to ask the panel to address this conundrum is to ask how they relate the concept of leadership to two qualities. One, character, personal character. The second quality is effectiveness, and how the effectiveness is defined, whether it is defined beyond the definition of concrete adoption of policies.
Richard, I think you can go first. Ron second.
Well, I think it's
Shirley
important.
third.
I think sometimes it's important to reverse the order on a panel.
Well, all right, we'll let Ron go. But wait a minute here. It must be said in Richard's defense, speaking only as a president watcher and a mere commentator here, I would have hated to see anybody on Phil's list as a member of the National Security Council staff. Just hated to. Maybe there's a clue there. Ronnie, you get just a couple of minutes, and then we'll take Richard, and then we'll let Shirley come in last.
There are lots of reasons why the term leadership is so confused in our common culture. Primarily, it's confused because it's used in internally inconsistent ways, contradictory ways. And we tend to resist using it in a sharper, more focused way, because that means a lot of the other ways we've been used to using the word no longer apply. It seemed to me that the measure of leadership is, has a person moved their organization or their society forward in tackling a tough set of problems. And then one can come up with a variety of criteria to evaluate that leadership in process before the outcome is determined. So some of the people on your list, Phil, I would not say exercised leadership. I would say that they were exceedingly prominent people, that they had enormous influence. Some of them had very powerful positions of formal authority, or at least extraordinary levels of informal authority in their society. Did they exercise leadership in that society? Well, maybe they did on some issues, not on others. At some moments, not on others. So I think that we come up with a much too simplistic formulation of leadership if we want to throw out these individuals as images of leadership without beginning to dissect what did they actually do in those societies, and on which issues, and at which times in their career. My guess would be a lot of the people you've mentioned listened very well when they had to certain constituencies at certain times to develop effective strategies. Maybe they weren't even leadership strategies in the sense of getting adaptive work done. Maybe they were effective, let's go over the cliff together strategies, but they probably did a lot of listening in their time.
Go ahead.
Interesting as usual, Philip. A couple of comments. One is I think it's useful to distinguish between what I would call crisis and situational leadership. Crisis leadership, when you've got a very focused moment where the stakes are enormous, where you have the luxury of zeroing in on one thing, where one issue completely wipes out virtually everything else on the political spectrum, as war and other great events tend to, gives leaders often a lot more leeway. Unlike situational things, which are almost part of the architecture, it's harder to push them aside. An example would be, for example, recently, healthcare was a situational problem. The ability to exert effective leadership there was extremely difficult because everywhere the administration pushed, and I think they pushed in fairly ineffective ways, but in any case, every way they pushed, they found that they were coming up against constituencies. Whereas in a situation like Haiti recently, because there's been an element of crisis, there's been much greater leeway for leadership to act. You can ask whether it was wise or not, but crises create opportunities that situations don't. Secondly, and probably even more important, if you look at a lot of the people you mentioned, to say the least, these were people who were operating in situations where you did not have civil society. You did not have separate organizations and constituencies with real political power for the most part. In a sense, these were not Madisonian settings, coming back to Dick's point, where you had countervailing, almost Newtonian checks and balances. But rather, you had very primitive societies in the political or democratic sense. So it was easier, if you will, for Lenin to do what he did in the Russia of 1915, if you will, 1917, than it would be, if you will, if a Lenin-like figure came around now. Indeed, one could say there might be some would-be Lenins there in the woodwork, but because of the nature of modern society, even in Russia, after 3/4 of a century of communism, it's just much harder to act that way because already there are many more independent forces, whether they're economic or political or technological or so forth. So I would think the times that we live in, which again have contributed to centrifugal tendencies and so forth, I think will make more difficult some of the types of leadership that you pointed out, unless we're in situations which are crises when lots of the normal constraints go by the wayside.
I find myself having a good deal of sympathy with what Richard's just said, and I'd only add two things briefly. One is that I think my one worry about Ronnie's thesis on leadership is that he defines outstanding leadership in terms of a leadership that goes with the grain of the democratic system. And while I have a great deal of sympathy with that, I'm not sure that that is historically a complete definition of leadership. Clearly there are people we recognize as leaders who, as Philip said, didn't listen because they weren't in societies where listening was one of the things that leaders did. And therefore one has to accept, I think one can't exclude leaders one doesn't like from the category of leadership just because one doesn't have the same values that they have. And I think Ronnie's definition of a good leader is a bit too closely tied to Ronnie's own values. And I sympathize with that, but I'm not sure it will quite do as a category of leadership. Secondly, if I can pick up what Richard said about civil society, I think that's a crucial factor. The United States is a country which has the great luxury that almost any decision that is made of a political nature, and I'm sorry to speak again in my own profession, is one which does not have catastrophic consequences. The United States has fairly wide margins within which it operates, and that means that if President Clinton gets it wrong, you will not be burned in your cities by the dropping of a nuclear bomb. In certain other countries, if their leaders get it wrong, the consequences are utterly catastrophic. They involve the introduction of Soviet tanks once upon a time, or the introduction of Nazi troops, or whatever it may be. Most societies live on the margin of life and death, and political decisions are about those consequences. In the United States, they almost never are, which is why in the United States, politics is seen as being essentially a technical subject and not a moral subject. And that goes some way to what Philip was saying about character. And that brings me really to the final point I want to make, which is that if you live in a society where there is not a rich, thick mulch of civic society, where there are not many decision-making bodies, but probably only one, which is the formal government of the day, it's the case that you are not driven to making decisions without listening to anything except your own conscience, which may be decisions that have the most tremendous repercussions. I don't know how much Václav Havel listened in prison to the consequences of his witness, but I suspect he didn't have that luxury very much. And so he had to take a lonely decision, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer had to take a lonely decision with regard to his attitude towards the Nazi state or the communist state. And so the only final point I want to make is that sometimes, deeply though I believe in listening, listening can actually be something of a luxury in some societies at some times, and one is driven back to the extreme loneliness of one's own moral principles.
Ron, I will give you a penultimate word later. But I think our standees are entitled to consideration now. Sir, will you state your name and where you're from, just so we can orient ourselves to you?
Nawaf Al-Sabah, and I'm a 1L at the law school. Dr. Haas, it's nice to see you again. First, an observation that the gentleman who asked the first question was reading off his list of leaders from a book with the picture of President Clinton on it. I don't know what that means. But the question to Dr. Haas is, as I was looking down my handy-dandy list of 5 criteria for leadership, I noticed that they seem to follow very closely the descriptions of the Bush administration. That by most media at least. How do you reconcile that view with a leadership by President Reagan, which was very different and didn't follow the exact listings? And on a second note, also, the Bush administration itself, we've been talking about individual leadership and not very much about group leadership, which is a lot of what the presidency is these days. That during the Bush administration, it was very much described as a cozy atmosphere between the principals, whereas in the Reagan administration, it was a constant battle between the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and many other factors. Could you address those points, please?
I'll try to do, I doubt I'll be able to do any of that justice. Let me start with your last point. The group factor comes in 2 ways. One is if there's an absence of meaningful participation by people other than the formal leader, the person at the top, it seems to me that the organization, if it happens to be the government of the United States or something other, will only have as much fuel intellectually as that person brings to the job, which may or may not be a lot of fuel. Leaders who deny themselves the advice and counsel of their subordinates tend to rob themselves of a good deal of intellectual sustenance. Secondly, the fact that people don't get along doesn't matter so much at that phase, but it matters a lot once the leader decides what he or she wants to do and when it gets around to implementation. And one of the characteristics, actually, of the Reagan administration, which became dysfunctional, was the inability at times to implement smoothly, but what ought to have been a policy implementation phase really became the policy development phase by another name, and issues just kept getting revisited and revisited, which made for long afternoons and not a lot of productivity. I would just say one thing about the Bush versus the Reagan administrations. It's a little bit awkward because I worked in both, so I will tiptoe a bit, but I expect my two colleagues will come down harder. I think the Reagan administration had stronger views than the Bush administration. Coming back to some of Shirley's language, it was less prone to listening. Ronald Reagan was one of those leaders who really zeroed in on a few things. And his ability to get some of those done was in some ways almost directly related to his refusal to listen. What I think you then have to ask yourself is two things. One is, because he was not particularly prone to listen, did the quality of his objectives suffer? And I think that's a fair point. I mean, again, one of the points I tried to make earlier is leaders who don't listen as much as others, their objectives may lose an opportunity to be improved, if you will. Secondly, you have to ask yourself, how many of his goals live beyond him? One of the problems of leaders who don't listen is their legacies tend to go with them, because they haven't built up a political culture and a coterie of people who feel that they participated in the making of policy. And as a result, they feel they haven't really invested in that policy. They don't feel they have a stake in that policy. So leaders who don't listen may get away with it while they exercise power, but they tend to leave fewer traces behind them than leaders who basically gave other people greater chances to participate. I would just say one thing about the Bush administration, where I think it was weakest, where it basically had inadequate direction. I think at times on the domestic and economic side, the administration paid a price for in some ways running out of fuel or running out of intellectual ideas. At least it was perceived that way. And to the extent that that's an unfair criticism, one of the lessons I learned from the Bush administration is that it's not enough to do what you think is the right thing. You have to make sure that the external environment is aware of it. That a government of stewards ain't enough. And government has to deal with external constituencies, and every step of the way it has to say, this is what we're going to do, this is why we're doing it, this is why we're not doing the alternatives, because people have to understand what you're doing in government if you're going to create potential support for yourself. It's not enough to do what you think is the right thing, even if it turns out to be the right thing, and it's certainly not enough to just do it if it turns out to be not the right thing.
Thanks. Now your question.
Yes, my name is Catherine Cross. I'm a Neiman Fellow and a student in Ron's class, and this question is for Ron. Implicit in the definitions of leadership that we've heard tonight is the idea that problems can be solved, groups can be led, things can be accomplished with effective leadership. My question is, can problems not be solved? Can things not be achieved even though the leadership is effective? And if so, how do you know those situations?
Let me respond to your question from two vantage points. The first is the person who is trying to do something, and he's trying every option that he or she can figure out, and nothing's working. There are a lot of situations where there are no options. Of course, you don't know till you've exhausted your imagination and exhausted all the people around you for ideas. I mean, there are times when, you know, if you were owned a shoe store as a Jew in Nazi Germany, the only smart thing to do was to get out if you could. You weren't going to go try to mobilize your town to stop this train coming down the tracks. But let me address your question now from a different point of view. When you say a problem cannot be solved, to my mind that means that the problem the adaptation required needs to be reframed. For example, person discovers they have cancer. Well, doctors might spend all their time defining the problem as curing the cancer. But given a condition that may be quite clear-cut as to its finality, there are a whole host of problems that then need to be addressed. How do you prepare the kids? How do you prepare the finances? How do you prepare your spouse for making the most of their life so that they can move on? How do you make choices in your own life to prioritize between this project you want to finish and the rest to let go? How do you discover how to make the most of your life when you live under a cloud for the next 6 months? So to say that, okay, you've come up against a problem that can't be solved is, to my mind, just, okay, well, now you've got a condition, and now what do you do with that condition? And there are a whole host of adjustments that need to be made to live with that condition.
Okay, one thing to that.
Yes.
I agree with what Ronnie said. Let me add one other thing, which is when problems can't be solved, it can often be counterproductive to try to solve them. I've written a lot about ripeness, and when you encounter problems that are not ripe, you can spend an awful lot of calories banging your head against the wall and trying to solve it, and it just ain't going to happen because the ingredients aren't there, there's not enough political will, what have you. It seems to me at that point, there's a lot to be said for political leadership that, rather than trying to solve the problem, tries to bring into play political forces that down the road will perhaps allow a more ambitious policy. So the choice is not between solving and doing nothing. The choice might be, if you will, to do some gardening at that point, to bring about some factors, some conditions that months or years down the road will then allow you or introduce certain opportunities that don't yet exist, which is why it's often so important to analyze whether a problem is ripe for resolution, because if it is, you want to go for it. You don't want to lose that opportunity. It may not be there in 6 months. On the other hand, if it's not ripe, it may be futile or even wasteful to try it, and what you want to do is perhaps either do something more modest or try to spend your time bringing about opportunities which down the road will allow you to be ambitious. And I think that's where analysis becomes really critical then.
Yes, sir.
Hi, good evening. Robert Murray, I'm a guest. I was wondering if any of the panel uses any of the old school Dale Carnegie leadership thinking in their books and/or lectures.
The old school
Dale Carnegie leadership.
Dale Carnegie.
Do you have a particular principle or idea from Dale Carnegie that you suggest that we might reflect on?
Just general. I can't think of any particular.
All I can say is the most critical review I got compared me to get Dale Carnegie, so it's a sore subject in my house.
That wasn't flattering. I don't think you're going to get a thing out of this.
Yeah, you'll get one thing from me. I mean, I think one of the things that Dale Carnegie brought forward, and it was
Thank you, Shirley.
it was quite, sorry, I wasn't correcting. It was quite revolutionary in his day, was the idea that you respected and, in a sense, attributed to the person who you were trying to lead their own qualities. In other words, you didn't treat them like so many pawns on the board. You treated them like people you had to discuss with, argue with, persuade, carry with you, so that you paid them respect. I mean, listening is paying respect. And one of the things that I think Dale Carnegie brought out, he put it the other way around. He said, if you show that respect for the people that you're conducting a dialogue with, they're much more likely to go along with your conclusion to that dialogue. It wasn't a bad perception, though nowadays we might put it the other way around.
Thank you.
I'm Anna Donald. I'm an MPP1 student. I just want to ask anyone in the panel how much they think that individual leadership is a historical construct and how much groups actually lead, like how much an individual actually leads the group or how much a group collectively moves forward with someone as the manifestation, if you like, of that group.
Ron, you want to take the first?
Well, it's a
short
terrific
crack at that?
question, and it represents a historical debate that's been going on for more than 100 years in political science and sociology before there were such labels for those fields. from a practical point of view, it's incredibly important for an individual to realize how he or she is caught in a web of influences, a web of social forces, as a member of any group trying to move in a direction, so that he or she can then take into account and not have those forces and not have some grandiose notion that it's all him or her. But I think it's also important from a practical point of view to make the assumption that you can make a difference. Now, is that true or not? I mean, it's hard to study. You can always reflect historically and say the individual is an epiphenomenon of profound social forces. But from the point of view of what are you going to do with your life, if you were to make that assumption about your life entire, you wouldn't be asking the question.
I would say it's a little bit the equivalent in the personal life of your genetic inheritance and who you are. Your genetic inheritance may give you a spectrum of possibility, and it's up to you by the choices you make and how hard you work to determine exactly where you're going to be. So you may not be Van Cliburn, but you could probably be an average piano player or a pretty good one. I would almost say it's the same thing. I think people have circumstances which perhaps put a range on what can possibly be affected. But within that range, people can make a tremendous difference. And it's not quite a great man theory of history because you can't ignore the circumstances. But within those circumstances, yeah, I've been in a lot of situations where had someone not spoken up, or if somebody else had been sitting in the Oval Office in a certain chair, I am convinced that social and historical forces notwithstanding, and the Annales School and all the rest of these sociological types writing history these days notwithstanding, that individuals really mattered on what finally happened. And time again, you just see it, that people make a difference.
Thank you.
Now, we've reached the witching hour. I'm going to allow each panelist, if she or he chooses, to have about a minute for any final comment of desire. But it is possible to spend that minute by simply saying, I pass. There's no requirement here. So why don't we start with Ron? Ron, you're looking thoughtful. I promised you a last word, so you really have got to have time to think about it.
Well, I have two things I'd like to say. The first is that it's really an honor to sit next to Richard. It didn't used to be an honor. But it's an honor because Richard did some great work for our country, for this country, some really great work. And I didn't bother him all the times I visited Washington during those years because I knew how busy he would be, but I was very proud of him. And I'm proud to be sitting next to him. And the second thing I'd like to say is that when I die and go to heaven, if I get to go to heaven, I'm going to ask that the next time I come around, I learn how to talk the way Shirley talks.
I want to say if the sign of a great leader is to make those who are supposed to be following him want to follow him, then Ronnie's got the answer. But two other observations. One is that I suspect that we are on the edge of trying to find completely new forms of leadership. One of the things that we're reluctantly facing up to is that the era of the nation state is close to over, and that nation states no longer have the power to actually arrest the major change in our society out of their tracks. I mean by this, for example, that virtually every country is now at best interdependent, and none of them are autonomous, not even the United States. And that means that the nature of leadership in the future is going to be very different than it was in the past. It's going to be about conflict resolution, about negotiation, about trying to find common ground. It's not going to be about individual leadership, independence, stating of national destinies, stating of national goals, because that's really what we've got beyond. And the difficulty for political leaders is to actually say to their followers, associates, listeners, colleagues, that the game is up, that it's a very different game now, and none of us are too ready to say that, because it is to admit that we are in many ways impotent in the faces of the forces that confront us. But having said that, I also would agree with what Richard said earlier, that side by side with the sense that the forces that are now existing in the world, the movement of capital, the proliferation of weapons, the rising challenge of disorder and chaos, are extreme challenges to us and to our capacity for leadership. It's also absolutely true, Richard's absolutely right, that most individuals tremendously underestimate the impact that they can have on history. It may be that this is the butterfly's wing in the chaos theory, that something very remote and very distant, very small, actually alters the outcomes, and that's certainly been, like Richard's, my experience too. And I suppose it's summed up in that marvelous ringing remark of Burke's, that it's enough for evil to triumph that good men should remain silent. Nowadays we'd say good men and women should remain silent, and it's something that one has to live with all the time. Did I remain silent when even the raising of my voice, small though it may have been, might have actually altered the outcome? I think it's something one has to live with every day of the week.
Richard, now that you are an announced great man, you have the last minute.
Since Ronnie embarrassed me, I am not, to show you how great I've become, I'm not going to embarrass him. But I am going to embarrass Dick. In the course of writing this book, I had the good fortune to read through all this literature. And sometimes I had the bad fortune to read through all this literature, much of which is truly awful. The book that held up better than any other is the book you don't see on this table tonight, which is his, On Presidential Power. And it's still the best book of American political science, which is maybe not the best way to say it, given most books in American political science. But it still explains better than anything else I've read the nature of how politics works in a society like this one, where again you've got a distribution of institutions and powers and authorities. And you deal with what ought to be, quote, the most powerful office in the land, and you realize all the constraints and how it is at times as much a book or more a book about presidential weakness as anything else. And it taught me more than any other book, and he taught me more than any other colleague. And so I'm going to end this evening on the note that it's great to be back here with these two people, but also with this fellow here who's done more for this field than really anybody I know.
Well, I'm embarrassed. And I declare these proceedings over.
Good. I knew I could do that.